My name is Ryan Sarpalis. Thanks for asking how to say my name correctly. I appreciate that. I manage a global onboarding for sales and customer success at LinkedIn. I've been there about 6 months, so why am I up here? I'm still learning a lot, and so what I'll share today is definitely not, I'm not the expert. It hasn't all worked for us, but I want to share a little bit about how we think about onboarding at scale. Prior to LinkedIn, I was with Meta and with Uber, and I've dealt with a lot of very large-scale programs, and so I thought I'd share some of the pain I've endured, and hopefully that's useful for some of the programs you may be managing as well. Quick agenda. I want to talk a little bit about today's workforce. Nothing probably new, but we can kind of commiserate a little bit about the state of things today and the challenges that's bringing. Specifically for onboarding, though, I'll talk a little bit about the problem of linear onboarding and how all these different complexities and the new challenges we have are throwing a wrench in these programs for us. And I'll spend most of the time talking about how we think about an onboarding ecosystem as a way to solve for this at scale. And then really most of the time on kind of some strategies and tactics, things that I found useful, again, not exhaustive, but hopefully would be of interest. Sound good? I know I'm post-lunch, but y'all were talking, so I feel like there's a good, like everyone's looking at me, that's good. The last few years, the world has been turned upside down, right? We've got between COVID and the economy and global conflict and all these different things are happening. And so really what we're seeing, of course, is the workforce is going through this great reshuffle, right? The CEO at LinkedIn coined this term last year where people are moving. They're moving in kind of time and place, meaning they can be in a completely different location and keep their same job. They can get a brand new job in their current location. They can use the skills they have to actually jump into a brand new industry. And so we're seeing a lot of that happen, right? And it's here to stay. Remote and in-office is another big challenge. So this is similar, but what we have now, of course, are hybrid strategies. We have some people at home working from home all the time. Some people coming into the office kind of when they want to. Some people coming in the office because they're told to. And that throws a whole kind of wrench into the way we think about tools and technology and the way we actually deliver our enablement programs. And then experience and expertise. So like I mentioned, people are picking up and jumping to another industry because a whole new world has been unlocked to them. And so we're seeing this kind of challenge in a lot of our enablement programs, but particularly for onboarding. Just to prove the point, there's some data here that talks about, we've got globally, and these numbers will look kind of varied all over the place, but you've got about 60% of the workforce globally who now can work remotely or in a hybrid environment. And about 85% would say their optimal way of working is to have a hybrid model. How many of you are like currently hybrid? Meaning you're in the office sometimes. Yeah, most of the people, right? Or the option to work from home. And if you're not hybrid, you're almost like fully remote. How many people are fully remote? It's like the rest of everybody. Yeah. So gone are the days typically where you're in the office all day, every day. And really this is here to stay, right? Corporations are actually thinking this is the strategy forward. This isn't a short-term fix to a COVID situation like it was maybe a year and a half ago. But industries and organizations are really thinking about keeping this in play. So with this kind of freedom, you have essentially unconstrained place and time. And so you see people move from kind of our traditional in the office 9 to 5 out to now, maybe they could be anywhere. They're still 9 to 5, but they could be remote. And you've got people maybe who, they're in the office, but they can come in whenever they want. And then of course, the majority of what we're seeing is anytime, anywhere. So even if you're not in the anytime, anywhere category, chances are you've moved into kind of one of these categories with your workforce. Fair? Yeah? Accurate? Okay. So let's talk about the challenges for onboarding. Again, the numbers here vary, but generally speaking, people are twice as likely to look for another job if their onboarding experience is poor. Almost 90% of people's onboarding experience is poor. So this is problematic. How many of you onboarded in the last 2 or 3 years to a new company or a new role? Yourself. You did it. Yeah, quite a majority, right? How was that experience? Yeah, poor, or what's the language they use? Yeah, it was lacking. Your onboarding experience was lacking. That's very broad. But generally speaking, we know that's true. It's hard to onboard people really effectively and have a really great experience coming out. And then the cost to onboard, though, of course, is very expensive. And this is not to mention the cost of not being productive, right? That's kind of the major cost that we're all trying to go solve for. But there's a huge investment from a company to actually identify, hire, get people to their starting points, and then you're investing them in training. So again, kind of an average number pulled out here, but you can kind of see the challenge. This is typically how we think about onboarding, and this is very generic, I acknowledge, but if you think about someone gets started and they go to orientation, so this is typically about the company, get your benefits set up, all that fun stuff, and then they'll move into a kind of product or process and skills training. We get them some of that, and then we kick them out the door and say, get to work, right? And they're on the job, and then on the job, they're also learning. So how many of you have either managed or have an onboarding program that has something going on beyond kind of their initial formal onboarding program? Intentional, kind of on the job. Yeah, it's a good, 45%-ish. And this works okay, but we have some problems at LinkedIn with this that I thought I'd share and that maybe resonate also with you. The first one is thinking through the problem of, is it coming? There we go. Sorry, I was laser pointing. That's not helpful. Experience and expertise. So our onboarding program currently managed is intended for an audience of sales and customer success, but that audience in of itself is spread across the spectrum of people who are brand new in their career. So they may have some initial experience, but they're really brand new to like sales in general. Then we've got people who are sales experts and come to LinkedIn, and so they're brand new to the company. They need to know our program and our product. And then we have internal transfers who kind of can fit all across the spectrum, right? They may know LinkedIn really well, but they're learning a brand new product. They're not new to sales, but they got to learn a brand new customer, right? So there's kind of this challenge we have here is a major one for us. Another one we talked about was start dates and time zones for us. So again, a global company, we have some people who start bi-weekly in some regions, weekly in other regions, and then monthly in other regions, and they all come to our program. And we got to try to solve for, okay, given this new way of working and this kind of always on everywhere workforce, how do we actually manage to this? And it becomes challenging if everyone's supposed to start at the same time in the same place and go through the same program with a limited number of facilitators or whatever it might be. Another systems and tools access. I see a lot of like sighing and head nodding in this one. When I'm out in the field and I talk with sales leaders, this is the number one thing I hear about is I don't have access to my systems and tools. And it's hard to say, well, that's not my job. I don't solve for that. But the reality is this really impacts the onboarding experience, right? Someone who doesn't have access to the platforms they need and the time they need it can really throw off, in particular, the ability to onboard somebody in a very linear fashion. And then the last is competing priorities. So not only are they going through onboarding, but all of a sudden they're being asked to jump into customer calls, or their manager is asking them to join a team meeting, or they've got an offsite schedule. And so there's all these different things that kind of come into play. And I'll talk a little bit more about that one in a second. Okay. Enough about the problem. We think about solving for this at scale by thinking about onboarding as an ecosystem versus a linear process or program. And really what that means is, what are all the various things that are in play when somebody is onboarding? And the reality is, your new hire is entering into an ecosystem, period. The question really is whether you are playing into that ecosystem intentionally, or you're just kind of letting it happen to them. And so we try to think about this ecosystem kind of broadly in this way. You still have kind of their flow they're going to move through, right? A new hire is still going to get through orientation. They're still going to have to get some of the basic training kind of move through. The reality is there's all these other things around them that we're trying to be really intentional about and play into. So I thought I'd share some of how we're thinking about this in case it's useful for you. And then, like I said, I'm learning myself, so I would love to hear from any of you how you're solving for some of this. So the first one on the left-hand side there is adaptive learning journeys. Who would say their program currently, let's talk about onboarding, has some sort of adaptive element, meaning it's not a one-size-fits-all? A few of us? Okay. Really, there are so many tools and technologies and things out there, platforms that make this possible, but what I've found is the way to solve for this is to really understand learner personas and to do a little bit better kind of learner needs analysis to really figure out what you can modularize and break down to make possible for somebody to go through an adaptive learning journey. So what I mean by this is, let's say someone comes into the role and they fit that category of tons of sales experience and expertise, but brand new to LinkedIn or brand new to your company. How do you kind of test out some of the basic sales skills training? Let them kind of say, yeah, I can do X, Y, Z. I've proven it to you, and then they're off to the next thing. Versus somebody who comes in, maybe is brand new to sales, but they've been at your company for a long time. They know all the company stuff, right? They might know your products even, but how do you get them into sales skills specific or sales methodology training? So thinking through this from a analysis and testing perspective is really important. So I'll talk more about that in a second also. Related to this is the idea of workflow learning and performance support. Heard about this a lot today, which is great. We think about just-in-time learning is a little different to me than workflow learning. The way we think about workflow learning is essentially what are you giving to somebody at the moment of need in the flow of work so that they can actually do their job effectively. The reason this is part of the onboarding ecosystem for us is really twofold. One is in that on-the-job kind of window where they're actually no longer being informal training, they don't have a lot of hand-holding happening. We want to be able to put things kind of at the moment of need when they're ready. That obviously helps them learn that correctly and get up to speed a little bit faster. But it also helps us take things out of onboarding. Y'all have been in the room when someone says, this should be in the training, and someone else says, this also should be in the training, and you're just getting like this laundry list of things, and all of a sudden your training is like bloated, right? And it's just got a ton of stuff in it, and we know that's not effective. So we leverage workflow learning and performance support to really push these things into the workflow and out of training. Recruiting and hiring is another one. So we're thinking about, while we don't own this within my team, this is a huge, important part of somebody's onboarding journey. I think you could make the case, actually, someone's onboarding experience starts before they even get recruited or even apply for your job, right? What's your company brand like? We were talking at the table back there. When I got hired on LinkedIn, after I kind of went through the process, I heard a lot of really great things about LinkedIn. I was like, cool, I'm very excited now. When I came into my first day, I'm really energized and ready to go. You can imagine the flip side if someone was like, oh, LinkedIn, that's too bad, right? And it's really tough. And then I'm like, I'm all down, right? Or my recruiting experience was really good. So that really goes a long way. And I guess my point here is think about how this is happening at your company and how you can influence it, even if you don't own it, because it does have a huge impact on how someone actually gets to productivity and performance. Another is culture and job immersion. This is similar, but we really are trying to think through how we actually build in culture and values into everything we do and every part of the program versus just at day one orientation. Mentorship and community. This gets a little bit into the idea of a buddy program. We heard some of this a little bit earlier and how you think through, is there somebody there to really be around an individual who is coming into this new role or into this new organization? And if they're flying solo, particularly in a remote environment, it's very difficult for them to be successful very fast. And so we're being really intentional about that. We call it a buddy program or a community of practice. And thinking through how you actually design for those, knowing that's really where that person is going to learn. They're going to learn the culture, they're going to learn how to do the job. Your training will be helpful. That's really where they're going to hear the, this is how it really works elements. So if you're leaving that off on the side or just thinking it will happen, it could come back to bite you. And then manager involvement. So we all know, the T is a little out of place. We all know how critical the manager is, right? To any onboarding program, any enablement program, frankly. And so we're really thinking through how do we make the manager experience really clear, simple, efficient, and focusing on the manager. Not just saying, hey, it's really important you're a part of this, but really actually make sure their enabling process is really smooth as well. All right, that's the idea of an ecosystem. I think we get that. I want to talk for a few minutes about how we think about this strategically. So what are some strategic elements or tactics that we think about when it comes to actually landing some of these things I mentioned in the ecosystem? The first one is this idea of performance thinking. Heard a lot about this today, which is great. But typically when you think about how somebody does their job, there's way more to how they get to productivity or how they perform their work beyond skills and knowledge, right? And beyond training. More often than not, your stakeholders are going to talk to you about training. I need training. The onboarding training should include, or we need to train them on XYZ. And in my experience, this is really challenging to get someone to get off the training train and onto the performance train, right? And so what my encouragement here is to think through articulating your conversations with your stakeholders in terms of performance, because that's the language of the business, right? That's the language of your clients and the language of your stakeholders. The examples I pulled up here are a methodology called 6 Boxes, which is a great resource to go look up. There are a lot of different performance consulting methodologies or performance methodologies. This one I thought was helpful because it's intuitive and it's pretty straightforward, but you can see that the top circle is kind of where we usually play in enablement, but in a lot of cases there's all these other things that go into it, right? Incentive structures. So for us, we have sales incentivized one way, And customer success, incentivize an entirely different way. And so how do we think about actually making sure that their performance and getting to performance is going to be on target? A lot of times there's actually some different levers we need to pull. Last thing I'll say about this is that this, again, is maybe not something you own in your particular organization or that you have control over. And so it's really important to think through how you put on a consultative hat and mindset to be able to really push these things along with your stakeholder and bring them into the fold. And to that end, I have a couple of things that I want to maybe dial in on. One is, this has been helpful for me, the forgetting curve. And this number, by the way, is fairly arbitrary, but we know we forget a lot of what we get in training. And I found this particular conversation really helpful with senior stakeholders. Just say, when was the last time you went to training? And I'll give you time. How much of that training do you remember? And they'll say, I don't know, not all of it. So you say, great. We need to stop spending so much time investing in formal training if people aren't remembering that training. Now, as learning experts, we can make that training really effective, right? We heard some examples earlier of how to make that really stick. But at the end of the day, we know people don't learn this way. The way they really learn is through a whole bunch of other things, right? Kind of the 70-20-10 model, where people are learning by actually doing. They're learning on the job. They're learning by tapping into their resources. And so if we are focusing on this 10% formal learning piece, 90% of what somebody is actually learning on how to do their work sits somewhere else. So the question is, are we playing into that, leading that conversation, or kind of letting it be done to us? Another big lever for us is measurement. So Samantha, well done earlier. I was just resonating with everything she was saying. I'll talk a little bit about some of the elements she mentioned when it comes to measurement and how that impacts onboarding. But the first one is this idea that correlation does not imply causation. We've heard that. If you've been in any kind of data scientist or data science or any kind of psychology class or anything, right, when you're talking about analyzing data. But the reality is correlation can cause you to go look at something, right? And so Samantha mentioned you don't have to be a data scientist or a psychometrician. You don't have to have all the data in the world. But what you are looking at, you can be the person to say, that's interesting, and kind of dive in and start to focus on it. So the way we do that is also using the Kirkpatrick model. There, again, maybe it's not perfect, and there's a lot of different models out there. But if you think about this framework, it's really intuitive, I think, and it's also pretty intuitive for your stakeholders. So I already had a slide on this, so I'll jump to this one. This is how we think about the measurement ecosystem for our onboarding program. We're not doing all this yet, so I'll share how we're thinking about doing it. And in some places we're better off than others, but typically we think about measurement as that green box, the sentiment piece, right? How did you like the training? How was your onboarding program, right? Asking the managers, how did you feel your employee came out? A really valuable measure. However, there are some other categories I think are important to consider. The first is an idea of a pre and post assessment. So this is another thing that's been very valuable in various programs that I've led in the past, where you have somebody coming in and pre-assessing, and actually if you can get somebody to say, hey, I know out of the 10 things I need to know, I know 2 of them pretty well. Great. Adaptive learning journey, you're off on a path to go learn those other 8 things, right? We're not going to train you on the 2 things because you already know those, and you can get to productivity faster. Post-assessment is a good way to measure whether your onboarding program is having the impact you expect from a knowledge and skills standpoint. So if I can do a kind of a pre and a post, that's a really easy, frankly, kind of lightweight way to articulate the benefit of your program and the impact of your program, but it's not everything. Formative and summative assessments, this is where it gets a little nerdy on the psychometrician stuff, but formative is just think like a knowledge check or a survey or a quiz that you kind of go through your program, right? Like, how's it going? You go through a module, let's kind of do a knowledge check. Did you get it? Great. And then at the end of your program, you're doing a summative assessment that says, we're going to certify you, we're going to do some major assessment and kind of be able to say, yes, you know all these things, and here's how we know that, and you can kind of send them off onto their journey. Predictive level 3, this is kind of getting into how do you predict how their performance on the job might be. And so again, I would argue that there's an opportunity for this as enablement leaders where, if I go back to this slide, and Samantha mentioned this earlier, the further up you go, the more expensive and the harder it is to do, right? Just generally speaking. And so if we can get some sort of data that gives us a signal about level 3 behavior and performance, we should be doing that. Some really easy ways to do that are to ask some questions during the actual program when you've got them. How do you think this is going to impact your job? Do you feel like you have the tools and resources you need? Has your manager been involved in this process? Do you feel like you have the support that you need? There's some really great data and research out there that shows that question actually is a really strong indicator of whether they'll actually perform on the job. It's not one for one, but it's a really good indicator. So that's what I mean by predictive level 3. And then on the right side of this, kind of after they've gone through this program, we're looking at all these different areas around, obviously, performance data, business metrics, and again, the presentation earlier talked about a lot of these examples, but also things like workflow learning data. Are they actually accessing the spec-it tool or widget? Are they actually going to job aids? Are they actually doing that work? That should be an input to how you actually are going to improve your program. There's a lot on here, so I'm not going to go in every single box, but just to give you a framework and how you think through measurement is more than just quiz, sentiment, see ya. Last lever for us is technology. So I'll end on this and then I'll give some time for questions. So I mentioned before how we tend to put everything into formal learning, right? You gotta know about the company, you gotta know about the product, you gotta know what's going on with your tools and systems. And so typically we push all that into training. And the idea of a workflow learning solution is really to take those things and push them into the workflow. And that's gonna drive up their performance because they're getting what they need at the moment of need. But it's also gonna make your actual formal training experience a lot richer. So normally this sounds like I'm talking myself out of a job because like you need less training is typically what I tell a stakeholder, right? You actually need to do less of this formal learning stuff. Because we think we can enable performance faster by pushing things into the workflow. And you are the expert, right? You're the person who brings the expertise to be able to say, this is how we know that, right? A couple of quick plugs for ways of thinking through this. Again, there's some platforms we've heard about today that actually help do this really well, but it really comes down to the way you analyze what people need to know. So we talked about skills earlier as well. This is a bit of a pain point in my team. I have a lot of people on my team who are from the field and really know sales, but they don't really know learning and performance very well. So we're spending a lot of time on like, how do you think about performance outcomes? How do you have a conversation with a stakeholder about getting to that? You know sales really well. How do you actually have the skills and build the kind of know-how to be able to kind of design this solution, if that makes sense? If you have a great workflow learning tool, awesome. How do you know what goes in there and what goes in the formal learning? So it's a technology element, but it really comes down to strong analysis. So I wanted to leave time for questions, but I'm happy to connect with anybody afterwards on LinkedIn or in person and answer those. But if you have any questions now, happy to take those.
Yes, the first question I have on here is, can you talk about how managers are involved in your onboarding program?
Yeah, I probably could talk more about how they're not involved. Yeah, so there's probably a spectrum. I would say that the way it's designed is that our manager actually is the one who enrolls them into our program. So we don't have an automated, you kind of join the company, you're automatically dropped into our program. And part of that is intentional so that we can actually, as they enroll, send them the information they need. We basically send them a guide that gives them the details about here's what your expectations are, here's what we want to see. The effectiveness of that is kind of all over the map, but I would say that's partly on us to solve for what do they need to help their employee do. Does that make sense? So just like we talked about, there's not a one-size-fits-all for onboarding. The manager really is the one who knows best that person's capability, that person's priorities, what that person needs to go do. So they need to be able to kind of uphold the onboarding program and at the same time help that person get to where they need to be. And that's going to look different based on their expertise and how much experience they have and everything else. So yeah, that's broadly how we think about it. Hopefully that answers the question, but I can add to that if needed.
I see your hand up over there. Go ahead.
Thank you. I have a question on the last slide that you just had about moving that like formal learning into more like a just-in-time learning. Do you suggest like sales enablement to put forth a plan on what that should look like in areas where those stakeholders are constantly like updating and engaging? Or is that like, hey, every quarter you guys should kind of like give us some of like your initiatives so that we can get on top of it and then work with you throughout the quarter to get those into the hands of the sellers? Like how would you suggest going about doing that so it's scalable?
Yeah, great question. There's two things I'll say that I think about. One is kind of that point about whether something is not just scalable but sustainable. So how frequently will this change? I think is a great question to help drive whether it should go in like a workflow learning tool versus in a formal training program. So that's one, you're hitting that nail on the head, right? Like if it's going to change a lot, actually it's a good use case for a workflow learning solution. The other way that we've thought about it that I found helpful is kind of doing, y'all may have heard of like a diff analysis, right? Where you're talking about difficulty, importance, et cetera. one tool we use called a critical skills analysis. And basically you're asking, how critical is it for this particular thing to be done correctly? And that's a scale, by the way. It's not like yes it is or no it's not, which most stakeholders want to say. It's all important, right? It's all critical. Put it all in. We kind of put it like a 1 to 7. Like how critical is this, right? 7 is like LinkedIn will stop operating as a business if you get this wrong. And 1 is obviously the complete opposite. So it kind of helps you get a sense of like really how critical it is. Then the other part of it is complexity. And I use that rather than difficulty because I feel like difficulty is rather subjective. What's difficult for me might not be for you. And so complexity is helpful too. Like how complex is this? Because if it's complex, we're going to treat it one way versus very simple, it might be a different way. The last thing is that idea of frequency. So how often are they going to need to know this or do this? And all of those can kind of, there's an art to that, but all of those kind of data points help you actually decide this is a good use case for workflow learning. For example, if it's very infrequently done, don't spend time on it in the formal learning because they're going to forget it. If it's frequently done, maybe you also cannot spend time on it, depending on how critical it is. Right? You say, look, they're going to do this all the time. We're just going to touch on it, and then they're going to learn as they go, and they'll get it. So that kind of helps. That's how we think about it in terms of determining that. But it's definitely, that's where kind of that half art, half science can kind of come in, and you can do that as like a designer or whatever it might be. Does that answer your question? Yeah, sure. Do you have another one?
Okay, next question. Do you have experience of performance coaching being implemented during onboarding? Do you think it's useful?
Performance coaching, I'd have to maybe ask for the clarification on the question. We don't have performance coaching as, so I guess I would ask like what we mean by performance coaching specifically. We do think about coaching. We have a coaching program obviously within Enablement, and right now the only place in onboarding that's touching for us is through as a coachee. Like what can you expect from coaching at LinkedIn? Because it's going to be different than it may have been where you were before. And then on the new manager onboarding, we have a whole thing on coaching and then doing enablement kind of there. So it's in the works, I would say, to optimize that. But currently, we're not doing a lot of performance coaching as part of the onboarding. But we do see a need to say, as the learner, as the new hire, like what can you expect and what does that look like?
All right, and the last question that I have on here is, so much to measure, so little time. How to speed, structure, and scale up through the measurement levels?
Yeah, so I would say that for us, and this is kind of where, again, on that journey that I shared, we're kind of at the building some of the basic pipelines for some of this. I think everything at like a level 0, which is not part of Kirkpatrick, but that's like just the measurement of the things happening is the most important thing to get done. So if you had to focus on what do I go measure, I would say, are you first of all even just able to say, this is how many people came through our program, this is their completion rates, whatever it might be, just at a very basic level. And then from there, I think level 1 and 2 are really important, meaning I do think that sentiment survey is important because it's very easy to do. So you can do it quickly, stand up a survey, and just ask those questions. I think level 2 is just very basic, like, and what that's the knowledge and skill piece, right? Like assessing that someone's coming out of your program. You want to have a good conversation with a stakeholder that says, yeah, we're at least quizzing them. We're at least doing a knowledge check, even if you're not full on testing and certifying, which we're on a journey toward. But that's one way to just kind of build out the ability to say to your stakeholders, here's the impact our program is having, right? Here's the volume of what's coming through. Here's the impact from a sentiment and a knowledge and skill standpoint. And then working toward the other things around performance. The last thing I'll say to that is I've found the thing that buys you some time when it comes to like maybe a hard stakeholder who's like, show me the data, show me the impact. Like, should I invest in this program? Is really asking them the question around business impact. So what are the business and performance metrics that you actually care about? A lot of times you actually can't get a real good answer from them, in my experience. A lot of times, like, yeah, they're looking at maybe revenue and all these other things, but connecting that back to human performance is really hard to do. So just by asking it almost invites yourself into the conversation where you can say, I want to know what that is and make sure my program's hitting that. And that'll tell you, okay, great, these are the 1 or 2 things that I'll invest in actually measuring versus trying to measure every single business metric under the sun. All right, happy to answer more questions if you have them, but appreciate the time.
Awesome. Thank you.